Welcome back to Games Lore to Sleep, where the harshest stories soften and ancient tragedies unfold like distant echoes drifting through a quiet night. Tonight, we explore one of the darkest, most concealed events in all of Elden Ring. A chapter of history so devastating that Queen Marika tried to bury it from memory itself. This is the story of Messmer's Crusade, a campaign of fire and extermination waged against the Hornsent people in the land of shadow. A crusade born not of justice, not of strategy, but of revenge, and of a god's desperate need to erase her own sins. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into forgotten lore, feel free to subscribe, or simply let your eyes grow heavy as we drift into this somber, shadowed tale. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let us begin. Long before fire consumed the land of shadow, long before Messmer raised his spears and erased entire lineages, there existed a wound deeper than any the Golden Order ever acknowledged. A wound carried not by gods or kings, but by a girl born to suffering. A girl who would one day become Queen Marika. To understand Messmer's crusade, we must first understand the pain that shaped it. For this war, despite its scale and brutality, did not begin as a political maneuver. It began as something far more intimate, a memory of violence, an inherited trauma, and a desire for retribution so powerful it would reshape history. Marika was not born into glory. She came from the Numen, a people of strange beauty and long memory, deeply spiritual and deeply vulnerable. Among them were the shamans, healers, diviners, and keepers of ancient rites. They were Marika's original family, her first world, her first sense of belonging. And the Hornsent, the dominant civilization of the land of shadow, destroyed them. The Hornsent were not inherently monstrous, nor did they enact their atrocities out of senseless cruelty. Their culture revolved around the Crucible, the primordial, swirling origin of life that predated the Erdtree. They believed in divine beasts, in transformation, in connection to ancient forms of existence. Their world was not one of order, but one of primal holiness. And the shamans, with their delicate bodies and strange gifts, were something the Hornsent believed they could use. The Hornsent harvested them. They captured shamans, tortured them, and stuffed them into jars, a ritual older than the Erdtree, meant to create saints or vessels of divine presence. The process was agony. Few survived it. Those who did became hollow sculptures of suffering, revered as sacred objects instead of living beings. Marika witnessed this, not as a distant observer, but as someone who lived among those who died. The memories seared themselves into her spirit, memories of screams echoing through the trees, of loved ones being taken, of faith twisted into torment. When she rose to godhood through the very mechanism the Hornsent had intended for themselves, through the divine gate they built, she did so not as a savior, but as a survivor. The Golden Order was born not from benevolence, but from trauma refined into purpose. And though Marika ascended to divinity, her memory did not fade. She sealed it, buried it, turned it into a quiet, burning core inside herself. Outwardly, she became the radiant figurehead of a unified order. Inwardly, she carried centuries of rage, not the explosive kind, but the cold, enduring flame of someone who had never forgotten what was taken from her people. This is why Messmer's crusade must never be viewed as a conquest. It was not a strategic expansion, not a religious mission, not a political necessity. It was revenge, revenge executed through fire, impalement, and ash, the very tools the Hornsent had once used to sanctify their own horrors. Marika did not simply wish to punish them. She wanted to erase them, to scour their beliefs, their rituals, their beasts, their gods, their memory from the fabric of the world. And so she gave this task not to Radagon, not to Godfrey, not to any of the champions who built her empire. She gave it to Messmer, a son tied not to the Erdtree's grace but to her own shadow, a child shaped for fire, shaped for obedience, and shaped to embody the vengeance she herself could not openly express. Messmer did not question her. Messmer did not hesitate. Messmer burned. But before the first horned effigy cracked in his flame, before the first impaled body marked his path, before the land itself screamed under the weight of his crusade, the wound beneath the Golden Order lay waiting, aching, remembering. And it is in that wound, in that silent, buried rage, that the story of this genocide truly begins. But to understand how this fire became a crusade, we must address something crucial, something long debated and finally clarified through lore, themes, motifs, and developer commentary. Messmer was not Marika's child alone. He was born from Marika and Radagon, two halves of one god, the singular being whose divided existence shaped the very foundation of the lands between. This lineage matters deeply, because children born from the Marika-Radagon duality were never born ordinary. Miquella and Malenia were born cursed, one doomed to eternal youth, the other to eternal rot. This was the price of being children of a single being split across two forms, two wills, two masks of divinity. Messmer too bore this consequence. He was born with the abyssal serpent coiled within his fate, a curse as profound and unsettling as those carried by his siblings. His red hair, unmistakably Radagon's lineage, marked him as part of the same bloodline that produced Radan, Rykard, and Rani. Even his boss theme echoes Radagon's leitmotifs. A musical thread from software uses consistently to signify parentage. Miyazaki himself referred to Messmer simply as a child of Marika, the same phrasing used for Miquella and Malenia, children born from a single god split into two bodies. In Elden Ring, this does not imply immaculate conception. It implies dual parentage by one divine being with two faces. Thus, Messmer was not merely Marika's son. He was the child of Marika and Radagon, and therefore a child of Marika-Radagon, the single divided deity. This is important not only biologically, but thematically. Where Miquella inherited empathy and Malenia inherited resolve, Messmer inherited flame. A symbolic fusion of Marika's suppressed rage and Radagon's fervent, destructive brilliance. He was not shaped by one parent or the other, but by the tension living between them. And as Marika's trauma grew heavier, as her resentment toward the Hornsent sharpened into intent, it was Messmer who stood poised to become the manifestation of her vengeance. But Marika never called it vengeance, not aloud, not even to herself. She framed the coming war in language Messmer could absorb: justice for the shamans, purification of the shadow, elimination of rival belief, prevention of a competitor's godhood. And yet every word was threaded with the memory of her childhood terror. When Marika looked toward the land of shadow, she did not see a rival culture. She saw the sight of her people's suffering. She saw the jars, the rituals, the blood. She saw what she had escaped and what they had done to the ones who could not escape with her. And so she made a decision no god should ever make lightly. She withdrew the grace of gold from the hornsent. Grace was more than blessing. It was belonging, identity, protection. Without it, the hornsent became outsiders to the order, spiritually condemned, metaphysically marked. It was a divine declaration that they were no longer part of the world Marika intended to create. This act was not strategic. It was symbolic. It was personal. Then, in the shadows of her throne, Marika instructed her son, child of flame, child of dual divinity, cursed by birth, to carry out her will. She did not ask him to wage war. She did not ask him to conquer. She did not ask him to bring the shadow into the light. She asked him to burn it, to burn the culture that once tortured her kin, to burn the beasts they worshipped, to burn the beliefs that rivaled her golden order, to burn the very memory of their existence, to burn until the pain in her past was reflected in the world she now ruled. Messmer accepted without hesitation, not because he was cruel, not because he was ambitious, but because he was the son of Marika Radagon, inheritor of her wounds, instrument of her will, and bearer of a destiny shaped before he ever drew breath. He saw no conflict, no moral dilemma, only duty shaped by divine authority. And so the crusade began, not with a battle cry, but with a quiet bow. A son bending to his mother's trauma, carrying a fire she could no longer hold herself. The first flames had not yet touched the shadow, but the path was set. A god had remembered her old wounds. A son had accepted their weight, and an entire civilization, unaware that their past sins had awakened the wrath of a divided deity, waited unknowingly for the storm that would erase them. The crusade had begun long before the first spear was raised. It began the moment Marika chose Messmer, the child of her dual self, to be the executor of her vengeance. Messmer grew up in the shadow of divinity, and also in its loneliness. Unlike Radan, celebrated for his might, or Rykard, revered for his brilliance, Messmer was a child whispered about more than he was embraced. His red hair marked him unmistakably as Radagon's blood, while the silent flame that curled inward around his soul revealed Marika's hidden intentions for him. He was born not into a home, but into a purpose. From the moment he opened his eyes, Messmer felt the dual heartbeat of his parent, Marika and Radagon, a single god divided into two wills. Their contradictions pulsed through him like twin tides, Radagon's burning loyalty and Marika's simmering resentment, Radagon's ordered heat and Marika's chaotic flame. Children born from that tension were always marked, cursed at birth, destined to carry what their divine parent could not bear. Miquella inherited innocence frozen in time. Millennia inherited rot that gnawed at eternity. Messmer inherited fire, a fire that was not warmth, but burden. This flame was not a metaphor, it was literal. Deep within Messmer slept the abyssal serpent, a mythic corruption intertwined with the concept of devouring flame and divine punishment. It gnawed at him from within, pressing against his ribs with a hunger he could never satisfy. To others, this curse would have been a death sentence. To Messmer, it became identity, a reminder that he was born to consume what his mother commanded him to destroy. Marika did not shelter him from this burden. She shaped him with it. Where other divine children had tutors, Messmer had silence. Where others had training, he had endurance. He spent his youth learning to withstand agony, to swallow heat that blistered his veins, to hold fire in his breath without screaming. He did not know why he endured these trials. He only knew that Marika watched him with the cold, assessing gaze of someone measuring a weapon. Yet Messmer loved her, deeply, dangerously. His devotion was not the devotion of worship. It was the devotion of a child who had nothing else to anchor him. Marika was his sky, his world, his God, his mother. Her approval was the only mercy he ever knew. And so he shaped his entire being around her expectations. The spear became his companion, flame became his voice, pain became his teacher. Messmer did not simply train, he transformed. His body adapted to fire as if it were a second bloodstream. Scars became constellations across his skin. His breath shimmered with heat. His hair, already red from Radagon's lineage, grew bright as a torch when his blood stirred. He learned to summon flame not through incantation, but through memory. Memory of the serpent's hunger, of Marika's gaze, of the purpose she had whispered into him before he was old enough to understand it. When he first ignited a spear without flint or spark, Marika only nodded. She did not praise him. She did not scold him. She simply accepted what she already knew he would become. Messmer cherished that smallest acknowledgement more than any accolade. This was when he began to understand the nature of his power. Messmer was not a warrior chosen by flame. He was a vessel created for it. Meanwhile, far from the capital, the Hornsent continued practicing their ancient rites. They communed with divine beasts, called upon ancestral spirits, and honored the Crucible's primordial chaos. Their divine gate, that structure of ambition and ascension, still pulsed faintly in the realm of shadow. To most, it was a relic. To Marika, it was a threat too severe to leave standing. The Hornsent did not know they were being watched. They did not know Marika's gaze had returned to the land that once broke her people. They did not know she had birthed children who bore the consequences of her divided soul, and selected one of them to become her instrument of retribution. Messmer's flame was not yet unleashed, but Marika's intentions for him grew sharper with each passing season. She introduced him to the stories of the shamans, not with weeping, but with calm, heavy detail. She told him how the Hornsent once called themselves the arbiters of divine will, how they forced their ascension through blood, how they attempted to claim godhood before she herself had risen, and how they had used her people, Messmer's ancestral kin, as fodder for their rituals. Messmer listened quietly. His flame simmered. Something old and inherited inside him stirred. He was not born when those atrocities were committed. He had never seen a Hornsent, but trauma flows through blood as surely as fire. Marika did not tell the stories to evoke pity. She told them to give him context, to tether his destiny to a legacy not of honor, but of vengeance. The more he listened, the more the serpent inside him uncoiled. The more he practiced with flame, the more he felt aligned with its hunger. The more he learned of Marika's suffering, the more he saw his own existence as an answer to it. Messmer did not become cruel. He became purposeful. He did not become hateful. He became loyal. He did not seek conquest. He sought to fulfill Marika's will. When Marika finally revealed her command that the land of shadow must burn, Messmer did not react with shock or hesitation. There was no sense of rebellion, no moral struggle, only acceptance. He bowed, quietly, deeply, completely. And in that bow, the Crusade was born, not in armies mobilizing, not in banners rising, not in a declaration of holy war. It was born in the mind of a son whose entire existence had been shaped to execute the unspoken desires of a god who once knew fear and suffering, and now wanted the world remade so those memories could never rise again. Messmer did not choose the flame chose him. Marika shaped him. Radagon's blood tempered him. The serpent within guided him. And when he finally walked toward the shadow, it was not as a prince, not as a general, not even as a child of divine lineage. He walked as the fire Marika had carried in silence for centuries, a fire she could not wield herself, a fire she placed in the hands of the one child who would never question why it needed to burn. The war did not begin with fanfare, banners, or a holy proclamation carved into stone. It began with something much quieter and far more dangerous. A private command from Queen Marika to her son. Go to the land of shadow. Erase the tower-dwelling folk. Leave nothing that remembers them. Messmer did not question her. He had been walking toward this moment his entire life without knowing its name. The army she placed under him was not the shining pride of the Golden Order. It was, in many ways, the opposite, an assembly of those the lands between could afford to lose, a force made from fragments, outcasts, and dangerous believers, an army that would never be truly welcomed home. There were the Black Knights, living monuments to the Crucible, the swirling, primal origin of life that predated the Erdtree. Their armor bore twisted, ancient shapes as if something half-beast still lurked beneath the steel. Once, they might have been honored as champions of a more ancient truth. Now, they were quietly inconvenient. Their very existence contradicted the golden narrative of a singular, perfected order. Sending them into the shadow solved two problems at once. There were conscripted criminals, dragged from cells and thrown into ranks, murderers, deserters, insurrectionists, people whose lives had already been priced and found cheap. Marika offered them a cruel bargain: fight and maybe die later, or refuse and die now. Most chose flame over the gallows, even if they knew that Messmer's crusade left little room for survival. There were perfumers, masters of alchemical mixtures that could heal, poison, or ignite with a breath. Their craft had always skirted the edge of taboo, too close to forbidden knowledge. Under Messmer, they were unleashed. Their glass vials carried fire that clung to skin, to stone, to divinity itself, an extension of his will, bottled and thrown. And there were nobles like Relana, blue-blooded, battle-trained, and spiritually displaced. She turned her back on her lineage to serve Messmer, shedding her old identity like a snake sheds skin. To some, she was a traitor. To Messmer, she was something else. Proof that even those born into the golden world could choose to step into the shadow and never look back. It was an army of those without grace, without honor, without a future in the lands between. And that made them perfect for what Marika intended. Messmer walked at their head, not as a prince basking in reverence, but as a silent star around which their fates revolved. The forbidden flame wrapped itself around his spear and coiled beneath his skin like a resting serpent. Where his siblings carried rot and stasis, he carried annihilation. When they reached the threshold of the land of shadow, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The light grew thinner, as if reluctant to fall here. The air felt heavy with old prayers. The land itself seemed to pause as though it recognized what was coming. The first target was Prospect Town. Prospect Town was not a fortress. It was a place of craft and contemplation, Hornsent artisans carving effigies, elders charting divine patterns, apprentices grinding pigments and metals for ritual. They saw the army coming, but they had never imagined a war like this. Wars, as they understood them, were contests of survival, dominance, negotiation. This was none of those things. Messmer raised his spear. The flame that answered him was wrong. Too bright, too voracious, as if it had been forbidden from touching the world and was now making up for lost time. Perfumers hurled vials that burst into waves of unnatural fire, coating walls and rooftops with burning liquid. Black knights crashed through doors and shrines. Criminal conscripts screamed as they followed, some out of bloodlust, some out of terror, all swept forward by the inevitability of the march. In minutes, Prospect Town was gone. Not captured, not occupied, gone. Bodies burned where they fell, statues cracked in the heat. The symbols of Hornsent faith blackened and peeled away from the stone. Messmer walked through the inferno like its calm center, the forbidden flame curling lovingly around his spear point. The massacre had begun. From there, the army moved to Bonnie Village. Bonnie did what Prospect could not. It resisted. Hunters rallied. Lesser divine beasts surged forth, storm wolves, serpentlings, bird spirits bound to old shrines. They fought with desperate courage, hurling themselves at Messmer's soldiers as villagers fled behind them. But this was not a war between equals. It was a purge. Messmer cut through the defenders with terrible efficiency. Each time a beast lunged, a spear met it. Many he impaled instead of simply killing, leaving their bodies hanging like grotesque standards above the battlefield. Being skewered was not a tactic of intimidation alone. It was spiritual sabotage, a way to prevent those beings from returning to the Erdtree system or cycling back into the Hornsent's belief structure. Impaled, they were trapped in the state of their suffering. The epithet began here, in whispered horror among the Hornsent who survived the flames. Messmer the Impaler. When Bonnie fell, fire rolled through its streets like an ocean. The perfumer's mixtures clung to everything. Nothing smoldered. Everything roared. Then came Belurat. Belurat was no simple village. It was a towered city of dancers and warriors, a proud center of Hornsent culture. Its defenders moved like water and wind, their movements an art form woven into combat. Divine beasts answered their calls, larger, more terrible, more beautiful than those of the outlying settlements. But Messmer's crusade was designed to break pride. The Black Knights clashed with beast warriors at the gates, armored forms colliding like echoes from two different ages. Perfumers turned alleyways into burning corridors. The conscripts died in ugly numbers, but their deaths did nothing to slow the march. They had always been part of the cost. Relena carved down Hornsent defenders in arcs of silver-blue steel, her movements a tragic mirror of the dancers she was slaughtering. She had abandoned nobility to join this war. In Belurat's flames, she proved that she belonged to Messmer's reality now, not the golden one she left behind. The great divine beast of Belurat, towering, horned, radiant with old faith, charged in a last effort to drive Messmer away. He met it without hesitation. His spear plunged into its jaw, and forbidden fire burst outward, consuming the creature from within. When it collapsed, he left it skewered, a smouldering monument to the death of Hornsent divinity. The fall of Belurat made one thing clear, even to those who had not yet seen the flames. This was not a war of conquest. No banners were raised over captured towers. No administrators moved in to govern survivors. Where Messmer passed, nothing was meant to remain. The tower folk had been stripped of grace. That alone marked them as condemned. The Crusade's purpose was not to push a border or enforce a treaty, but to erase a people, to scour their culture from reality until only ash and silence remained. From the perspective of the Hornsent, the war was not a struggle, it was a sentence. One they had no chance to appeal. One delivered by a god whose pain they had long forgotten, and a son whose existence had been shaped around the execution of that forgotten sin. Messmer did not see himself as cruel, he saw himself as necessary. The forbidden flame within him flickered in agreement. By the time Messmer's army carved its way through Belurat, the Hornsent world had begun to buckle under the weight of a truth no one had spoken aloud. This was not a campaign. This was an erasure. Rumors spread faster than flame. Whispers of children impaled on spears, not for strategy, but for symbolism. Whispers of divine beasts falling in numbers unthinkable. Whispers of an army that did not take prisoners, did not negotiate, did not stop. The land of shadow, once loud with ritual drums and beast song, grew quiet. Too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. For the Hornsent, the shadow had always been home, a place suspended between worlds where ancient rites shaped their days and divine beasts shaped their dreams. Now, that home was shrinking. Settlements that had stood for centuries disappeared in hours. Shrines that held ancestral memory burned until their stones cracked from heat. And with every new assault, Messmer's army grew more efficient, its violence more methodical. The Black Knights no longer fought like mercenaries. They fought like the embodiment of the crucible, the chaotic, swirling origin they once belonged to, unleashed against the old faith that mirrored them too closely. Their armor twisted mid-combat, sprouting horns, wings, or claws in fleeting flashes of their ancestral forms. They were monsters shaped into night, and the shadow feared them more than flame. The criminal conscripts had either died or hardened. Those who remained had stopped screaming during battle. They followed orders with the numb precision of people who knew their survival hinged on pleasing the flame-touched prince leading them. The perfumers became devils of alchemy, unleashing mixtures that did not simply burn. They melted, mixtures that clung to skin, climbed walls, seeped into the roots of ancient trees. Their craft, feared by Lendel, found its perfect environment here, where no one would survive long enough to report its horrors. And Relana had become a legend. The Hornsent began calling her the Pale Twin, a blade dancer whose silver blue arcs of death mirrored their own sacred dancers, but twisted, corrupted, turned against them. But Messmer was changing most of all. The longer he waged war, the more the forbidden flame within him responded. It recognized death. It recognized old sins resurfacing. It recognized that the Hornsent, who once sought divinity through sacrifice, were now the sacrifices. The flame became hungrier. Messmer did not smile. He did not rage. He did not speak more than necessary. But his silence changed. There was no longer a boy behind his eyes, no confused prince trying to understand why he had been chosen. The war had clarified everything for him. His role was not symbolic. It was essential. The more he fought, the more he believed in the righteousness of purging a people who had once tortured the shamans of his mother's blood. Marika's trauma had become his purpose. And the Hornsent felt the shift. Among their last surviving enclaves, elders whispered of an old prophecy, one that spoke of a flame-bearer whose fire would not illuminate but consume. Some believed Messmer was a divine punishment sent for their ancestors' sins, Others believed he was a false god who had stolen flame from a higher power. Most simply saw him as death incarnate. Desperation took root. In the southern reaches of the shadow, haunts and matriarchs initiated forbidden rites to awaken long-sleeping beasts. Trembling hands traced spiral patterns into the earth, calling upon spirits older than their lineages. Wind beasts emerged. Stone beasts took their first breaths in centuries. Serpent spirits unfurled from roots and riverbeds. But the flame that approached them was not normal flame. It was the forbidden flame. The flame that Marika should never have allowed to exist. It burned not only flesh and structure, but divinity itself. It burned symbols. It burned memory. It burned the conceptual essence from which gods were made. When Messmer reached these awakening beasts, they barely had time to roar. He impaled the first before it stood fully upright. He burned the second until its divine essence evaporated. He severed the horn of a third and watched its body collapse in a heap of ashen fur. The matriarch's chants grew into wails. The beasts that embodied their people's oldest rites were dying like common animals, and something ancient cracked. The Hornsent understood now that the Golden Order had not come to defeat them. It had come to ensure they never rose again. Fear turned to hatred. Hatred turned to curses. Curses turned to omens. In a hidden cavern beneath the roots of a great shadow tree, Hornsent shamans gathered around a dim pool of black water. Their grief poured into it, grief so deep it became magic. They tore at their flesh with ritual knives. They invoked beasts long dead, and in their cry something new was born, a curse that struck not at Messmer, but at Marika herself, a curse that demanded she feel the fear, the pain, the despair she had inflicted upon them. They called it retribution, they called it balance, they called it justice, but to the Golden Order, it would become the curse of the omen. The reason children born to Marika's line emerged with horns, with deformities, with bodies the Order deemed impure. The Omen children were the Hornsent's final victory. A victory won not through steel, but through suffering. Messmer, of course, knew nothing of this yet. He simply sensed a shift in the air, a heaviness, a spiritual sickness rising from the land. But he did not stop. He believed every village burned brought him closer to fulfilling Marika's will. Every beast slain was a memory of her pain erased. Every Hornsent warrior killed was justice enacted across centuries. The land changed. The flame changed. Messmer changed. He had not yet reached the divine gate. He had not yet reached the seat of Hornsent ascendancy. He had not yet confronted the final truth of what Marika intended. But the shadow was shrinking, and the fire was growing. The deeper Messmer pushed into the land of shadow, the more the Crusade stopped feeling like a war and began to feel like something else entirely. Wars have fronts, retreats, negotiations, pauses. This had none. The Hornsent were not being pushed back, outmaneuvered, or brought to heel. They were simply being erased. Village after village fell. Sacred sites burned. Divine beasts died on spears or disappeared in curtains of forbidden flame. The Hornsent were running out of places to retreat to, and yet, somehow, the Crusade did not feel closer to an end. It felt like a wheel still turning, long after its purpose had already been fulfilled. Messmer's soldiers sensed it first. Something was changing, but it was not the enemy. The Black Knights found their crucible-touched armor growing inexplicably heavier, as if the very air had thickened around them. The perfumers noticed their mixtures did not burn quite as fiercely, their flames flickering shorter than before, Men and women who had once felt grace burning in their veins like a blessing, now felt it pulse unevenly, bright one moment, dim the next, as though a hand somewhere far away was hesitating. Messmer felt it in the serpent within him, the abyssal presence that had once surged eagerly at the scent of battle, now coiled sluggishly, its hunger dampened by an invisible pressure. His flame still answered him, but slower, as though moving through water instead of air. The shadow was not resisting him. Something else was. At the heart of the realm, the last remnants of the Hornsent had gathered around the divine gate, the towering structure that once symbolized their path to godhood. It rose above them like a final, unfinished prayer, a monument to what they might have become, had Marika not claimed that ascension for herself. Here, the Hornsent made their final stand. Those who still had faith prayed with hoarse voices. Those who had lost it sharpened weapons or clutched children. Hornsent warriors lined the paths leading up to the gate, horns and helms gleaming dimly in the half-light. They knew they could not win, but there is a difference between surrender and refusing to run. Messmer's army approached like a slow-moving storm. Chains dragged, armor creaked, glass vials clinked softly. R'hllana walked at his side, blades at the ready, eyes fixed not on the Hornsent, but on the horizon beyond them, as if she, too, sensed something incomplete about the moment. The divine gate stood in the distance, pale and impossible. Messmer felt drawn to it in a way he could not quite name. His mother had once stood there. She had ascended through its power. Her memory haunted the structure like a second shadow. Somewhere far away, Marika was thinking of it too. She had ordered this crusade. She had stripped the Hornsent of grace. She had sent her cursed flame-bearing son into the land of her childhood to eradicate those who had tormented her people. And now, as Messmer raised his spear beneath the same gate that had granted her divinity, she found herself staring into the mirror of her own past. To finish the war would mean facing that truth. To let it continue would mean admitting what she truly was. The guilt she had buried beneath centuries of divine rule began to stir. She had told herself this was justice, that the Hornsent had earned their fate, that her golden order was a necessary correction to a cruel and chaotic world. But Messmer's crusade dragged those old rationalizations back into the light, and they did not hold as firmly as they once had. Messmer, unaware of the turmoil above him, signaled his forces to prepare. Black knights planted their feet, perfumers uncorked vials, criminal conscripts tightened their grips on borrowed weapons. The last Hornsent raised their horns and spears, knees shaking but unbent. The divine gate watched silently. Messmer lifted his spear. He expected flame to race along the shaft with its usual eagerness. Instead, for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the fire came, late, sluggish, as though something had tried to hold it back and failed at the last moment. He frowned, just slightly, and then the world changed. The sky over the land of shadow dimmed, not like night, not like storm, but like a curtain being drawn. Light did not fade. It was smothered. Sound grew dense, muffled at the edges. The wind stopped. Even the crackle of fires seemed to hesitate. Divine will fell over the realm like a shroud. The boundary of the shadow closed. It was not a wall of stone or a barrier of flame. It was a ceiling, a metaphysical verdict laid upon an entire land. Pathways that once led back toward the lands between simply weren't there anymore. Routes Messmer's scouts had used vanished, as though swallowed by fog that never parted. The sense of outside evaporated. The shadow was no longer a place at the edge of the world. It was a box. Grace withdrew in full now. The faint, uncertain pulse his soldiers had felt sputtered and died. Those who had been granted Marika's favor for answering Messmer's call felt it ripped from them like threads pulled out of their souls. Some fell to their knees, gasping. Others cried out in shock as the invisible warmth they had trusted their lives to turn to cold. The serpent inside Messmer recoiled, outraged, stunned. For the first time since the Crusade began, his flame did not feel like it belonged to him. It felt stranded, contained, as if the realm itself had been made into a cage and he was locked inside. He looked up, searching instinctively for some sign, some voice, some hint of his mother's intent. None came. No godly whisper, no comforting vision, no new command, only silence. Around him, confusion rippled through the army. Black Knight snarled, sensing the shift, but not understanding its source. Perfumers clutched their dwindling vials. Conscripts shouted conflicting orders at each other, their fragile sense of structure collapsing with the loss of grace. The Haunsant looked around too, and understood sooner than anyone else. The realm had been sealed, not to protect them, not to save them, to bury them, to bury the war, to bury the truth. In that moment, the nature of the Crusade changed for good. Messmer had entered the shadow as an executioner sent to erase a people. Now he stood as a prisoner in the same grave he had been ordered to dig. The army he led could march, burn, and kill as much as it liked, but nothing they did would ever leave this place. No songs would be sung of their victory. No monuments would be raised to their sacrifice. No scholars in the lands between would write of the Haunsant's fall. Marika had decided. The world would not remember. The world would not see. The world would not know. The sin would remain here, locked away, pressed beneath the lid of shadow. Messmer, still holding his spear aloft, realized with a slow sinking clarity that his war had been stolen from him. Not the fighting, not the killing. That could continue forever. But the meaning, the purpose, the possibility of an end. He had not been sent to simply destroy a people. He had been sent to join them in oblivion. The land of shadow was no longer a battleground. It was a sealed wound, and he was trapped inside it. The sealing of the realm of shadow should have ended the Crusade. Any ordinary war, when cut off from its supply lines, its command structure, its nation, would collapse into confusion and force a desperate retreat. But Messmer had no retreat. There was no outside anymore, no lands between waiting for his return, no capital expecting reports, no mother's voice guiding his next steps. The shadow had closed and Messmer remained exactly where Marika had placed him. At first, the army waited. Soldiers gathered in clusters at the edges of the sealed realm, staring into the dimness where paths used to be. Scouts walked into nothingness and returned trembling. Even the Black Knights, usually so stoic, grew restless. Perfumers stopped uncorking their mixtures. Criminal conscripts whispered rumors about abandonment, about divine betrayal, about doom. Messmer said nothing. He stood at the center of this growing storm of uncertainty, with his spear grounded beside him, flame coiled tight around the metal. His eyes were fixed not on the horizon, but on the divine gate in the distance. He understood what the sealing meant long before anyone else dared to speak the truth aloud. Marika had ended the war without ending it. The Haunsant were not yet extinct. Survivors hid in valleys, forests, cavern shrines, families scattered into the deepest shadows, warriors limped away from burning villages, small groups fled into ravines, still clutching relics or children. The horn scent had not been fully erased. And now, with the realm sealed, they could not escape. But neither could Messmer. He was trapped in the same fate he had been sent to deliver, condemned to keep fighting a war whose completion had been rendered impossible. If he killed every hauntcent he could find, more would hide. If he burned every shrine, new ones would be built in secret. If he slaughtered 10 today, 20 would appear tomorrow, rising from grief, from fear, from pure hatred. Marika had not sentenced him to victory. She had sentenced him to continuation, an endless, cyclical conflict, a war without an exit, a punishment disguised as purpose. The Black Knights were the first to push back against this reality. Their ancient instincts stirred. Beasts of the Crucible do not tolerate confinement. Their armor twisted unnaturally as they snarled at the sealed boundary, striking at the invisible barrier with weapons that left no marks. The perfumers reacted differently. They grew quieter, faces pale as they whispered about grace diminishing and supply thinning. Their mixtures, potent as they were, had limits. Without resupply, even flame becomes scarce. The criminal conscripts panicked. Some attempted to flee into the impossible void and vanished into the mist, never returning. Others turned on their commanders, only to be cut down by Black Knights moving with terrifying precision. Through all of this, Messmer did not flinch. The serpent inside him writhed uneasily, enraged by confinement, confused by the sudden absence of divine guidance. The forbidden flame crackled along his spear, starving for purpose. Messmer understood it better than any scholar ever could. Flame cannot endure without intention. Fire without a future flickers, questions itself, seeks destruction simply to prove it still exists. Messmer's flame was no different. If he did not burn something, he would dissipate. If he did not continue the crusade, his purpose would unravel. If he did not fight, he would become hollow. And so he chose. He ordered the army to move, not toward a final battle, for such a thing no longer existed, not toward a decisive end, for Marika had prevented one, but toward motion, for movement was survival, and flame must consume to endure. The Haunsant learned quickly. This war was not ending. This was the beginning of something worse. They retreated into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the shadow. Mothers hid their children beneath roots and in forgotten tunnels. Warriors used rituals meant for divine beasts to mask their presence. Elders called upon relics so old they had no names. Messmer hunted them all. He stalked the valleys, burning their pathways. He hunted the tree lines, impaling shadows he suspected were haunts and scouts. He moved through the darkness with the patience of a serpent, striking without warning. And each death fed the flame that was the only thing keeping him whole. The Haunsant's hatred grew stronger than their fear. Their curses intensified, echoing through the shadow like living things. Some whispered that Messmer had become a beast of divine punishment. Others believed he had become something worse, a god of suffering, a figure whose presence alone ensured agony. When Messmer slew a family hiding in the ruins of a shrine, an elder raised a bloodied hand before dying and spat a final curse. May your mother's children bear our horns. May your legacy rot from within. Messmer heard the words, but did not yet understand their price. The curse of the omen had already been set in motion. In time, the army fractured. Supply lines no longer mattered. There were none. Morale no longer mattered. There was no world to return to. Recruitment no longer mattered. No one new could enter the sealed realm. Some knights deserted, disappearing into the shadow with stolen rations. Some perfumers hoarded their last vials, preparing for a final stand against anyone who approached them. Some criminals surrendered to madness, running screaming into the sealed horizon. Messmer remained. He became a fixture of the realm, as inevitable as the dark sky overhead. His movements shaped the shadow's new reality. His flame dictated the rhythm of survival. The Haunsent began to teach their children not simply to hide from him, but to expect him, to know that he would come again and again, like the turning of a wheel. He visited their last shelters like a storm that kept returning to the same coastline, not because he wanted to, not because he hated them, but because he no longer knew how to stop. The sealing had turned him into something he never intended to become, the eternal punishment of a people caught in a god's forgotten wound. Messmer the Impaler, Messmer the Condemned, Messmer the Flame that cannot die. Every spear he raised, every beast he burned, every Haunsent he slaughtered, pushed the crusade forward without ever moving it toward resolution. An eternal war, a looping nightmare, a divine mistake trapped in a cage of shadow. And somewhere beyond the sealed barrier, Marika looked away. In time, the crusade lost whatever shape it once had. It no longer resembled a campaign with a goal or a mission with an end point. It became a storm pattern, a shifting, cyclical rhythm driven by Messmer's movements and the Haunsent's desperate evasions. Entire generations could have passed within the sealed shadow, and still the war would have looked the same. A prince of flame-hunting ghosts, a scattered people clinging to survival through hatred alone. Hatred became the Haunsent's inheritance. It began as grief. Grief for their dead beasts, their shattered shrines, their burned cities. Grief for the children impaled as warnings and the elders burned in their prayer halls. Grief for a culture that had been severed at the root. But grief that cannot escape becomes something sharper, something heavier, something poisonous. For the Haunsent, hatred was not merely emotional, it was spiritual. Their curses were not empty words. Their rituals were not symbolic gestures. The shadow itself listened. Their prayers to extinct beasts now carried new shapes, shapes born of agony. Their rituals to honor ancestors twisted into pleas for vengeance. Their invocations became open wounds on the fabric of the sealed realm. And slowly, painfully, all this suffering crystallized into a curse that would change the fate of the lands between forever. The curse of the omen. It did not manifest as a single moment of sorcery or a catastrophic explosion. It appeared as a whisper in the dark, a faint ripple in the divine order. Horns began to symbolize suffering, literal horns, grown from the heads of children in the outside world, children born under Marika's rule, children who carried the weight of the Haunsent's dying wish for justice. These horns were not a blessing. They were a reminder, an echo of the beast Messmer had impaled, a physical manifestation of a people's last scream. Omen children were feared, punished, locked away. Their existence contradicted the Golden Order's promise of purity and divine stability. But for the Haunsent, trapped within the sealed realm, the curse was the single proof that their hatred had reached beyond their cage. They could no longer pray to the divine beast. Messmer had slaughtered too many. They could no longer rely on their rituals. Shrines had been reduced to rubble. They could no longer trust in their gate. Marika had stolen its meaning long ago. But hatred remained, raw, unfiltered, undying. When Haunsent elders taught their children to fear Messmer, they did not speak of him as a prince or a demigod. They spoke of him as a sin-given flesh, a devouring flame, a curse in human shape. They taught their young to hide not simply behind walls, but behind silence, behind stillness, behind the kind of watchfulness that animals use to survive predators. And so every Hornsent child grew up believing that the sky itself would burn them if they stepped into the open. Their hatred coiled inward, like a snake waiting for warmth. They did not imagine a world where they might defeat Messmer. Such hope had died the day Marika sealed the realm. But they imagined a world where their hatred would live longer than he would. A world where one day, someone strong enough would reach the land of shadow and carry their vengeance outward. Messmer, for his part, did not understand the depth of this evolution. He saw only resistance that refused to vanish. He saw Hornsent warriors emerging from caverns with fresh markings on their skin, markings carved from grief. He saw shrines rebuilt only to be burned again. He saw curses in their eyes, felt them press against his mind like buzzing insects, but he did not understand their origin. He thought hatred was a simple emotion. He had not yet realized it had become a force. Sometimes, in the quiet spaces between battles, Messmer stood on ridges overlooking burned valleys. Wind pushed ash across his armor. He watched small groups of Hornsent move through the landscape, carrying wounded elders, hiding infants beneath cloaks, whispering prayers to beasts that no longer existed. And though he did not pity them, he felt something he could not name, a flicker, a memory, a doubt. But the flame inside him smothered it. He bore the serpent's curse. He bore Marika's command. He bore a purpose that could not be questioned. And so, he resumed the hunt. Hatred continued to grow, transforming from a reaction into a legacy. It leached into the shadow soil, into its rivers, into its breath. Even the trees absorbed it, their bark twisting with scars that echoed the Hornsent's agony. The land did not simply look wounded. It became wounded. Some Hornsent believed Messmer would one day tire, that his flame would dim, that he would weaken as the realm's ceiling tightened. But hatred teaches caution, not hope. Others believed that the only way for their people to find rest would be for someone, anyone, to kill Messmer. Thus was born a different kind of child, not merely a survivor, not merely a refugee. A Hornsent raised from birth to hate Messmer so deeply that their hatred alone could cut through the flame. The lineage of vengeance, the generation born with fire in their blood, not their own fire, but Messmer's reflected back at him in the form of weapons and will. In time, these children would grow. In time, one would rise. In time, one would confront Messmer not as a victim, not as prey, but as equal. But that moment had not yet come. For now, Hornsent hatred was a quiet fire, one that smoldered in caverns, whispered under breath, carved itself into stone walls, and echoed in lullabies sung to children who knew nothing but fear of the flame-bearer. Messmer hunted them endlessly. They hid endlessly. Hatred deepened endlessly. The war no longer shaped the shadow. Hatred did, and hatred, unlike flame, never tires. Thank you for drifting with me through this long, shadowed history, a journey into forgotten wars, sealed lands, and the quiet tragedies hidden beneath Elden Ring's golden myths. Stories like Messmer's Crusade linger differently in the mind. They burn slowly, like embers that refuse to fade, echoing with the weight of people who are lost and those who are shaped by loss. Here on Games Lore, to sleep, we take these heavy tales and let them settle softly, letting their edges blur so your thoughts can ease into rest. If you enjoyed sinking into this calm retelling, if the rhythm, the imagery, or the lore helped your mind slow down, feel free to stay for more stories, more worlds, and more quiet nights. Before you drift off completely, remember, you're always welcome here. There is always another tale waiting, another mystery to unravel at a gentle pace, another world to explore without haste. If you'd like to hear more lore in this soft bedtime style, you can support the channel by subscribing, liking the video, or leaving a comment about which story you'd like whispered next. Your suggestions often become tomorrow's journeys. For now, let the last traces of flame fade away. Let the shadows soften. Let your thoughts drift, slow and safe, towards sleep. Good night, and thank you for listening.